This is a Global News special presentation.
Hello, I'm Robin Gill, and thank you for joining our special post-debate coverage. It was a big night for all 6 major party leaders who squared off on the same stage for the first time. Our very own Donna Friesen was one of the moderators. And let's get right to the highs and lows. To help us take us through what's at stake, we're joined in Toronto by our national affairs editor Eric Sorensen and Darrell from Ipsos. And in Gatineau, Quebec, our Ottawa bureau chief Mercedes Stephenson is at the venue and keeping an eye on the debate. Now, if you didn't see any part of the debate, here's a longer exchange that encapsulates what this night was all about.
You bought a pipeline. You can't be a climate leader and spend $10 to $13 billion more on a project that by itself blows through our carbon budget. We have to actually
a slogan is not a plan.
No, we have a plan.
A slogan is not a plan. It is an unrealizable plan. Canadians need that action that is going to actually make us better, fight climate change, protect the environment, and build a stronger economy for our kids. That's what we have done more over the past 4 years than any government in the history of Canada. And there is much more to do. There is much more to do.
No one remembers Paul Martin's plan in 2005. It was better. But the reality is, if you have
over the past 4 years, we delivered on it.
If you have a fire in a 4-story building, getting a 1-story ladder doesn't do it.
That is completely false. And just because you say something over and over and over again doesn't make it true. There's no Canadian that believes that they're going to be better off by paying a carbon tax. You have given a massive exemption to the country's largest polluters, and your plan is already
the experts,
failing.
the parliamentary budget officer points out 80% of Canadians
based
are
on
better
your numbers.
off
He had to trust the numbers you gave him. Nobody believes your numbers, Justin, because you
do
have
not want to act on climate change, Mr. Scheer. You were doing nothing. You are reversing the only plan we ever had.
You promised to balance your budget this year.
Let me put it out here for you guys.
One at a time.
But life is getting more expensive.
Mr. Singh and then Mr. Bain.
I want to say this directly to Canadians. You do not need to choose between Mr. Delay and Mr. Deny. There is another option.
All right, let's bring in Mercedes Stephenson first. Mercedes, things got quite heated between the leaders, particularly between Justin Trudeau and Andrew Scheer. But you also, at the end, just how comfortable NDP leader Jagmeet Singh seemed on stage. And there were many more moments like that. What stood out for you?
Well, what really stood out for me was the amount of passion you saw. We haven't seen them engage directly before, and at times it was difficult to understand them because they were all trying to overtalk each other. No one wanted to cede the floor, which was a challenge, but you really saw them get into direct confrontation and take each other on. What was interesting to me is that Justin Trudeau, who's the incumbent, has the most to lose. He managed not to be the most attacked person in that debate, even though he's been the prime minister for the past 4 years. And when you're the incumbent, that's really the strategy. You don't need to win the debate, but you also don't want to lose it. Andrew Scheer took a lot of attacks, but he was also much more aggressive than we've seen in the past. Jagmeet Singh, some of the best lines of the night that he delivered on climate, Mr. Delay and Mr. Deny, as you heard there, and also the one on women's rights, where he came out and was talking about abortion and said a man has no place in a woman's right to choose. So he had some really powerful lines. Also interesting that Monsieur Blanchet had such a large role in the English debate. He really waded in there and took people on the provinces, especially on Bill 21, which, as you know, some federal leaders have been reluctant to really condemn because there's a lot of votes connected to that in Quebec. And then, of course, we had Mr. Bernier on the stage, which was very controversial. And he tried to own the stage at times, but he wasn't really successful in doing that.
Eric, let's bring you in. 6 leaders. That's a lot to take in, and everyone was trying to get a word in. What do you make of all of that?
Well, you had the Prime Minister, as you would expect in all of the debates that we've seen through history, is the Prime Minister is the person that's at the center of this. They all want more votes that belong to the Prime Minister's party from the previous election. So they all go fishing in his swimming pool. And so you have Scheer not laying a glove on Singh, but going after Trudeau. You have Singh not laying a glove on Scheer, but going after Trudeau. So he was very much the target in all of this. And he was, I think, in some ways trying to embrace that, to say if it's climate versus pipelines, well, we actually believe in both a pipeline and climate, while the other two were sort of staking out the turf on one side or the other. But Darrell, what did you read from all of that?
Well, I thought the person who was the most interesting tonight was Mr. Singh. He seemed to be the most at ease. He was laughing several times during the course of the debate, and really seemed to of the leaders that we saw tonight be most comfortable in that environment. And based on what we've been tracking tonight on behalf of Global National, what we're seeing is that he actually is the one, if Twitter traffic is any sort of representation, who's impressed the most tonight.
Talk a little bit more about that Twitter traffic, because I was looking at the graphs you showed, and it was interesting. Both there's a volume side of it and there's a sentiment side. And what were you seeing there?
Well, we were seeing that most of the conversation was obviously taking place around the two big leaders, so Justin Trudeau and Andrew Scheer. Scheer a little bit ahead in terms of over Trudeau in terms of sentiment, but the leader who consistently rose both in terms of volume and in terms of positive impressions all through the night was Jagmeet Singh.
Yeah, and we only heard him there for a second, Robin, where he said, you know, you don't have to pick between Mr. DeLay and Mr. Denai. It was a short clip from him, but it was one of those that captured the moment of Singh kind of showing off in this. And I think you would agree, Darrell, that if Singh is doing well, that's not necessarily good news for Mr. Trudeau and might be better news for Mr. Scheer.
Well, in fact, that's what the whole thing is tonight. If Mr. Scheer can just simply hang on to what he's got and turn his vote out, he's actually in a pretty good position. Sorry to disagree with Mrs. May. But when you turn over to the question of the progressive vote, that's kind of bounding around between at least three options that were there on the stage tonight. And if Jagmeet Singh's capable of pulling even a couple of points away from Justin Trudeau and turning them out on Election Day, it's actually better news for Mr. Scheer than it is for anybody else.
Yeah,
Let's go back to Andrew Scheer for a second here. Right off the bat, he went on the attack with Trudeau. Let's have a listen here.
Justin Trudeau only pretends to stand up for Canada. You know, he's very good at pretending things. He can't even remember how many times he put blackface on, because the fact of the matter is he's always wearing a mask. He puts on a reconciliation mask and then fires the Attorney General, the first one of Indigenous background. He puts on a feminist mask and then fires two strong female MPs for not going along with his corruption. He puts on a middle-class mask and then raises taxes on middle-class Canadians. Mr. Trudeau, you are a phony and you are a fraud and you do not deserve to govern this country.
Eric, we suspected this would happen. How is this negativity going to resonate with voters?
Well, I think they had made a determination in the Conservative Party at the outset of the campaign that to attack Mr. Trudeau, to go negative, so to speak, against Mr. Trudeau was going to pay dividends. And I think you saw that the strategy there played out in the tactics here, because that clip you just showed, that was literally 10 seconds into the debate that Mr. Scheer was asked about leadership, and he spoke about leadership for a few seconds and then immediately was on to Trudeau with those very harsh comments, and probably, you tell me, Darrell, making some ground with that?
He made some ground with that, but you know what was interesting to me, Eric, was that it wasn't really representative of how he behaved through the rest of the debate. It was like he was going to hit hard at that one point. He did hit at a few other points, but not nearly as aggressive as that mere 20 seconds of really going after Justin Trudeau very directly.
When they had a chance to go at each other, it seemed like Scheer was more into the game of wanting to really attack, and then not maybe as much with the other leaders, but that Scheer was up for that. Trudeau seemed to be kind of taken aback, like he'd taken a body punch at one point, and then kind of disappeared a little bit from the middle of the debate.
Yeah, he didn't have a great answer.
No.
Mercedes, you talked about the fact that Trudeau had to debate as an incumbent. How did he fare in that 10 seconds, actually?
Well, you know, I think that he fared well in the debate in that he managed to hold his ground and he managed to stand out. He had to deal with some pretty serious attacks at times because, of course, unlike the others, he has a record that he has to try to defend. He was passionate, especially on the climate change issues. That's where you really saw him come out, but he didn't really break through on that until the end of the debate. Nonetheless, if you can sustain being the person who's trying to convince people to vote for you while you're under attack from all directions and appear calm but also strong, that's really the line. They never want to look like they're too aggressive in this, but you also have to be able to take each leader on. And I think that he did relatively well in managing to do that tonight and walking that line.
Throughout the campaign, Trudeau has been attacking Doug Ford. Here's another example from tonight.
With certain provinces right now, we're fighting on the defining issue of our time because Jason Kenney and Doug Ford and other Conservative premiers don't want to do anything on climate change. And we need a government in Ottawa that is going to fight them and fight for Canadians on climate change, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Darrell, is this strategy working?
Province of Ontario. But I thought Mr. Scheer had a very interesting rejoinder a little later in the debate when he actually said, Mr. Trudeau, if you're so interested in taking on Doug Ford, there's an opening in the province of Ontario for the leader of the Liberal Party. Maybe you should go run there. And it was one of the only times we actually heard the audience laugh in the course of the debate. But I would have to say that it's a reasonable position for Mr. Trudeau to take, and it is paying dividends for him in the province of Ontario.
We're going to go back to
Robin,
We're going to go back to Mercedes. Mercedes, was there any substance here for any real discussion given the format?
Well, it's an interesting format because this is the first time we've seen it with this many leaders on the stage, and you had 5 different moderators on top of that. You did still see some of those really sparky moments of engagement, which we weren't sure they would get, but it's an awful lot of issues, not a lot of chance for follow-up, and a lot of people talking over each other. There was, though, I think, more substantive policy discussion tonight than we've seen at significant points in the election campaign, which has been primarily dominated by leaders attacking each other. That was still there tonight, but you had them actually talking about climate change, Indigenous issues, although frankly they skated over a lot of that and turned it into a climate change and pipeline debate. But they actually were forced to start talking a little bit about what they do and trying to differentiate and make themselves more distinct from others. There's been a lot of feedback from voters and viewers who say they're frustrated with sort of nasty mudslinging that's been going on, and there was still tones of that tonight, but you at least had some serious discussions on areas that are of concern to Canadians.
Darrell, let's go back to you for a second here. What did you think about the format?
A lot of people doing a lot of talking tonight, and that included not just the debaters but the moderators. It was a pretty fulsome crowd, I would say, on the stage. The real shame here is that we're only going to get one English language debate in the course of this campaign. And as you can see from the discussion tonight, there's an awful lot more that needs to be discussed.
Eric, is there enough for voters to decide what they're going to do with this?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things we've seen in the campaign so far is that voters have not moved very much. Even when there have been, very hot-button issues that have arisen, the numbers have moved a bit and then they've settled down again. And I don't know that we've seen a lot tonight that would move a lot of those voters. You saw where the leaders all staked out the territories you expected of them. Elizabeth May on climate, Mr. Singh on the issues he was looking at, Mr. Scheer going after Mr. Trudeau trying to bridge that gap between the left and the right. I don't know that they will have moved a lot of voters, but therein lies the fight for all of them, just to get at votes, to move a few votes in a few ridings that can make the difference on election night.
Eric, was there a specific issue, though, that was illuminated?
I'd say probably, as Mercedes was saying, it would be climate, because it kept weaving its way back into those other topics, and it was also the one that went at the end. You do lose some of your viewers after, almost 2 hours. They drop off a little bit, having heard an hour and 45 minutes, say, on other topics. But climate had a way of working its way in. There's a real distinction between the parties and where they stand. You felt the passion from them. So I would say on climate, you were seeing some of that distinction. And Darrell, I would imagine that it's where Mr. Scheer must be pleased that he's got a sort of a base of voters he can count on, while the other side is splitting up that vote 3 and 4 ways.
Yeah, it's basically a fight among the progressive party options, so the NDP, the Liberals, and the Green Party, over the same issue and the same voters, whereas the Conservatives can kind of stand back a little bit on this one.
You guys talked about how Jagmeet Singh has been doing well, but he has been criticized for not going hard on Bill 21 and barely campaigning in Quebec. Let's take a listen to how that came up tonight.
Mr. Singh, you have spoken very eloquently about discrimination and fought against it all your life. And that's why it's so surprising to have heard you say, like every other leader on the stage, that a federal government under you would not intervene in the question of Bill 21 in Quebec. It's a question where, yes, it's awkward politically because, as Mr. Blanchette says, it is very popular. But I am the only one on the stage who has said, yes, a federal government might have to intervene on this because the federal government needs to protect minority rights, needs to protect language rights, needs to protect women's rights, and needs to do that right across the country. You didn't say that you would possibly intervene. You didn't even leave the door open, and that's not leadership.
Let's be honest for a second here. Every single day of my life is fighting a bill like Bill 21.
So why won't you fight it if you form government?
Every single day of my life is challenging people who think that you can't do things because of the way you look. Every single day of my life, I channel the frustrations of people who feel that as well, that many people across our country who are told that they can't achieve what they want because of how they look.
So why not
I'm running to become
act
Prime Minister
on your
of this country,
convictions
I'm going to
and
Quebec
leave the
and telling
door
people,
open
I want to be
to
your Prime
challenging
Minister.
it?
Mercedes, was this an opportunity for Singh to address this issue?
It was, and it's one getting pressure from some inside the NDP and the former NDP leader Thomas Mulcair to step up and address. In fact, Mulcair has said that he lacks basically the moral courage to do this. Singh obviously wearing a turban, and with the recent racism that we saw him experience in Quebec with the man who came up and told him he'd like to see him win, but he should cut his turban off to look more Canadian, has such a position of strength to speak to this. But he has been very reluctant to say that he would take this bill on like some of the other leaders. He has said, look, let Quebec deal with this in court. There are people in Quebec who are challenging it there. That's the appropriate place. Instead of saying, yes, if I win, I will challenge this in federal court if it does not succeed in the Quebec challenge. Now, people wonder, why would somebody like Jagmeet Singh, who has talked about his faith and has talked about being discriminated against, not want to stand up to this bill? And a lot of analysts say, look, this has to do with the number of seats that are in Quebec. This is a popular bill in Quebec, and anything you say against it could damage you. That said, the NDP is not doing that well in Quebec right now. They've really been struggling. He's not campaigned there much at all, and saying anything could damage him. But Justin Trudeau, by far, taking the strongest stance on this in terms of saying that he's at least willing to leave the door open to challenge it. And the fact that that's the strongest stance out of all the federal party leaders on a bill that is very popular in Quebec and very unpopular in the rest of Canada, I think is telling about the battle for those seats.
Eric, let's talk about Singh's reluctance to go hard on this issue. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that if the NDP loses almost all of their seats in Quebec, it wouldn't be a surprise to see the NDP then join in with a challenge, a court challenge to Bill 21 in Quebec. And I think we saw Justin Trudeau tonight go as far as I've heard him go without actually saying, and yeah, as soon as the election's over, we're going to issue a challenge. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that is what he's signaling. All of them, of course, are sensitive to not wanting to lose seats, because if they lose seats, they're going to make the case, if we lose seats, we can't do the things we want to do in government anyway, so first we have to win the seats, then we can take the stance. But he was right to challenge Singh in a sense, because Jagmeet Singh is kind of relying on the idea that, hey, I have a personal experience here. The challenge there is then, well, why wouldn't your government go forward with it? And so Trudeau is trying to sort of distinguish what his government is willing to do, even though he has not gone all the way to saying yet that they will challenge it.
But Darrell, the reality is that Singh hasn't done much campaigning in Quebec anyway.
Yeah, he really hasn't. And to the truth be told on this, I mean, we get into the technicalities of things like Bill 21. I mean, how many people actually outside of the province of Quebec understand what Bill 21 is? The polling's not really convincing on that, and I know there's some suggestion that people don't support it in the rest of the country. There are elements of it that actually do have a certain amount of support in the rest of the country. There was another poll on that was released today. But the point on this is it's really not about Bill 21, it's about tolerance. And it's about the fact that Mr. Trudeau had some challenges on that as a result of the incident that was unfortunately revealed about him earlier in the campaign. And quite frankly, if we're talking about tolerance, the person who's probably best qualified to talk about it, as impassioned as any of the leaders can present themselves as, is Mr. Singh. So I don't think that there's anything that he would lose on this, even as the topic is being discussed. There's really not anything that anybody else has in terms of a stronger position than he has.
Was there an issue, though, that he wasn't able to address in this debate?
Well, I was a little surprised that he didn't go back on that question of Mr. Trudeau being so passionate about the issue of Bill 21 and tolerance in Quebec, and just remind people who were watching what had happened a couple of weeks ago and the need for Mr. Trudeau to actually apologize to Canadians and to Mr. Singh personally. He had an opportunity to remind people about that, and it was a little surprising that he didn't. In fact, the leader who did bring that issue up was Mr. Scheer.
Mercedes, what do you think of that?
Well, I think that it really was significant in terms of how you saw this playing out in the debate and the way that you saw them trying to deal with it, the way that you saw the different leaders trying to position themselves and insert themselves. And overall, Justin Trudeau managed to really maintain himself on a number of issues despite those attacks. Singh, I think, still had the best lines by far of the night. And in terms of the debate, most Canadians won't have watched the full 2 hours like we did. We enjoy it. We're the political nerds. This is what we live and breathe for. But those clips that will come out of this debate, which are defining, Justin Trudeau looks relatively strong. Andrew Scheer looks like he was tough. But it's Jagmeet Singh who probably had those lines that are really going to play with the average Canadian at home. They're short, they're snappy, and they make a lot of sense.
All right, we're actually going to hear from Mr. Singh now.
The Supreme Court, of course, any prime minister legally would have to take a look at it. But at this point, what I want to make very clear is I'm working every day when I go to Quebec, letting folks know that that's not the way to go ahead. Divisive laws don't help our society, and I really believe in uniting and bringing people together.
Okay, and on a slightly different subject, the NDP is still more than 15 points behind in the polls, and your party has been in a distant third since the beginning of the campaign. Do you feel that your performance tonight is enough to close that gap in the 2 weeks remaining in this campaign?
Well, I hope the performance tonight, I hope that Canadians got to see the choices that they have in this election, that they don't have to choose between two parties that are working to make life easier for the richest, but making it harder for everyone else. And I'm hoping people see in me someone that's willing to fight for them. Because I don't work for the rich, I work for people. And I want to make their lives better with healthcare investments, housing investments, and tackling the climate action, the climate crisis.
Bonjour, Michel Lamarche, TVA.
C'est où?
Ici, Monsieur Singh. Sur la loi 21, on vient de vous entendre. Vous semblez avoir changé de position. Là, vous nous dites qu'en tant que Premier ministre, si ça se retrouve devant la Cour suprême, vous allez
if this ends up before the Supreme Court, you will be able to review this law, to look at it once again. Well, it's a legal avenue for any Supreme Court decision, but I have always said that now that there are proceedings, I don't want to meddle in these proceedings, and I'm going to show that bill that divides the population is not a good thing. What I want to do all the time is to find ways to bring the population together. But if it ends up in Supreme Court, you will intervene if you were to be Prime Minister. Well, it's a legal question at the moment. And so, legally speaking, all Prime Ministers have to look at what is happening in the Supreme Court. That's just a normal thing.
Hello, Mr. Singh, Hannah Thibodeau, CBC News.
Hannah!
Hey. I would like to ask you, coming into this, you felt that there was one too many people on that stage. Do you still feel that way, and do you still feel that Mr. Bernier should not be here on Thursday?
I made my position really clear on that, and nothing changed after tonight.
Do you feel, you said leading into this that this was going to give him the venue to spew hate. Do you feel he did that tonight?
I think that it's clear with the propositions of that party, the type of commentary they make, it's divisive, and I don't think that has a place.
Monsieur Singh, Philippe Vincent Foisy, Radio-Canada. Je veux juste bien comprendre ce que vous dites.
I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that the door is open for a new democratic government to intervene in the Supreme Court with regards to the law on secularism. I just want to say that legally that's something that's a possibility. As a lawyer, I understand that this issue is raised when something is before the Supreme Court. Legally speaking, a Prime Minister has to look at what is taking place. I've always said that I don't want to meddle in proceedings that are presently but I am not in agreement with laws that divide the population. I'm only in favor of laws that bring people together. But Mr. Trudeau said he is open to challenging this law. On the other hand, Mr. Scheer says, no, we will not intervene if it's in the Supreme Court. So, and you told Quebecers that you wouldn't interfere. Today, are you saying that you wouldn't interfere in the Supreme Court? Or are you saying that there's a legal possibility? Is there something that you might resort to? You have to be clear. No, there's no difference. What I'm saying is that there's a normal process that exists. And what I've always said is that I do not want to meddle in proceedings that are in the courts now. It's important not to meddle, not to interfere. I'm going to repeat that. If you ask this question again, I'll repeat the same thing. It's been the same position.
You talked about how you want to fight that you fight Bill 21 every single day. So why are you not willing to fight it for the people that don't have the place or platform that you have right now?
Well, I mean, I'm using my platform really clearly. I go to Quebec and I'm saying I want to run for Prime Minister, and I get asked the question every single day. Right now in this press conference, I get asked the question again and again, and I welcome that. I want to be able to take the opportunity to say it's wrong to divide people based on the way they look. And I want to win over people in Quebec and let them know it's wrong to divide people and make it legal to divide people and to discriminate someone just because of what they wear. It's wrong. And I have the opportunity to do that every single time I go to Quebec, and in fact, every single time I have a press conference. And I'm happy to make that really clear. It's wrong.
It's wrong, but you won't intervene.
Well, there's a court challenge right now, and I make it really clear. I do not want to interfere in any way with that court challenge, and that's been my position. I'll be very clear on that.
But you won't intervene on your. You won't get involved on your own. You see it as something separate from what you intend to do.
I think it's very important that we don't interfere with the court challenge, and I made that really clear.
Would you leave the door open, like Mr. Trudeau has said, to a court intervention?
Well, Mr. Trudeau is just stating a matter of fact, just the fact that there's. No, I'm saying that very clearly. He's just repeating a matter of fact. I said it already, that there is, anytime a court matter gets to the Supreme Court, the government takes a look at it. He's just stating a matter of fact. That's true. Any Prime Minister has to look at a court issue that gets before the Supreme Court. So, of course. What I'm stating is that it's a matter of fact that any matter that gets to the Supreme Court, the government and the Prime Minister will take a look at it.
Justin Ling, freelance. This debate was supposed to be an opportunity to talk about foreign affairs, and we didn't really get there. So I'm wondering if you have any opinions about what Canada ought to be doing in terms of northern Syria. The Trump administration just greenlit Turkish invasion of northern Syria. Would you have Canada defend our Kurdish allies?
I think it's really troubling what Mr. Trump just decided. It's going to destabilize an already really unstable region. A region that's been plagued with massive human rights violations. I think that first and foremost, we've got to put international pressure on making sure people's human rights are protected, that there isn't going to be a massive just damage and perhaps horrible violations against the Kurdish people. We've got to make sure at a global level we're working towards peace and diplomacy, and this decision is going to destabilize a region that's already facing a lot of instability.
On a totally different question,
sure.
Would you accept a cabinet post in Justin Trudeau's government?
And what I made really clear is that I'm running to become Prime Minister. And as Prime Minister, I will work with anyone that wants to advance things like universal pharmacare and our dental care program. I've only ruled out one party, and that's the Conservatives.
Monsieur Singh, l'inaudible, la presse canadienne. On va essayer une dernière fois sur
We're
la
going
loi sur
to
la
ask you a question one last time about the secularism law. You said that once it gets to Supreme Court, the Prime Minister has to look at it. Does look at it mean to interfere or not? It's a hypothetical question, but what I can say is that legally, a Prime Minister has to look at all the cases that are before the Supreme Court, and as Prime Minister, I will look at it. And what I can say, not hypothetically, is that I've always said that I don't want to interfere when there are proceedings, and that is my position. And what I want to do as a candidate with a turban is to show Quebecers that I am someone that fights against the climate emergency, that is pro-choice, and I'm against laws that divide. When you say you won't interfere, does that mean that you will not participate in a challenge on the secularism law, even if it got to the Supreme Court? Is that what you're saying? I've always said what my position was. It's very very clear. I don't want to interfere into an existing proceeding. We don't have any issue with the proceedings presently. What I want to do is win the hearts of Quebecers to show them, look, I'm someone who stands up for the rights of women, for the LGBTQ community, to fight against the climate crisis, to create a more just society and fight against tax havens. And yes, I wear a turban, and we can work together.
Jagmeet Singh taking questions from reporters post-debate. Let's go back to Mercedes, who's also at the debate venue. Mercedes, he just can't seem to dodge those questions about Quebec secular law.
Yeah, it's interesting because he did make a small shift there, but it was significant, Robin, because in the debate he said basically they would not intervene, that they're going to allow the province, people challenging it there, to deal with it at that level. But then he said, well, you know, maybe Supreme Court, that might be the level they'd look at. He's under a lot of pressure here because this is where the NDP has a big disconnect. In other areas, they have an advantage because they don't really expect to be able to form the government, so they can make a lot of big visionary promises that the other parties can't necessarily afford to make. But on this one, they have a disconnect between what they're preaching in terms of values and then what's actually happening in terms of the promises they're making that aren't aligning. And you've had Tom Mulcair, the former NDP leader, and others really attacking Singh on this, calling for him to do more. And you could sense that tension there in the press conference, that he's trying to inch along a little bit at a time, but he's still not coming out and saying, yes, absolutely, we want to challenge it. How can a bill be so against your party's principles and yet you won't commit to doing something about it?
You know, at the beginning of this campaign, Jagmeet Singh was not just the underdog, he was the underdog because Elizabeth May was kind of stealing his thunder. She seems to have faded into obscurity at this point.
Well, you know, Robin, what we've seen is that Singh is a natural campaigner. When he's out on the campaign trail, and I was on his bus, he's really comfortable and warm with people, but that still hasn't translated into support at the polls for him, and he's mostly been campaigning in and around BC and the GTA, the Greater Toronto area. So the question is, does tonight's debate translate into support for him or not? In terms of Elizabeth May, she came in on a high. People were saying the Greens could hold the balance of power. They could end up being the third party. They could displace the NDP. Darrell can speak to this far more, but they've dropped in the polls, and she's largely been invisible in this campaign. She had some strong lines tonight, but she hasn't performed to the degree that a lot of people expected her to heading into this.
Darrell, let's talk about the fact that Elizabeth May has been invisible.
Yeah, she really has. And what we saw was that they started off a little better in the campaign than they are performing today. And part of the problem she has is what you saw on the debate stage last night, where there's a lot of people who are basically saying the same kinds of things that she is, mostly on the environment. So as long as the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens are all fishing for the same group of voters, and they're all talking about how they're going to overachieve each other on the environment, it's a little hard for her to break out and have an independent voice in the discussion.
Québécois, and Yves-François Blanchet is about to speak, so let's go over to Gatineau and see what he has to say post-debate.
Bien, bonsoir, messieurs, dames.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was an exercise that was surprising, and I'm very happy to be able to speak in French all of a sudden and publicly. It was a surprising exercise because it was quite difficult to really put forth proposals, but I don't think we have to come back to the way the structured was debate. But however, if there's certain things we want to come back to, we could do that. I'm still happy to have gone through this exercise with a minimum of issues. Did you understand that Jagmeet Singh's position with regards to secularism law has changed? Well, at some point it's very difficult to understand anything about this issue of secularism. The closest collaborator of Mr. Scheer was saying that it was only Andrew Scheer that was going to defend Bill 21 in Ottawa, but that's not what he said in English tonight. Mr. Scheer perhaps tempted by the fact that he can speak in English, and to people from the West, meant that certain things came out more than others. So there in terms of the hostility that is shown against Law 21 by Mr. Trudeau, so that's one extreme, and Mr. Scheer on the other extreme says that he'll do nothing. But it's always with this spirit of tolerance. We'll tolerate that Quebec is a nation. We'll tolerate that they have a secularism law. We tolerate that they want to protect their language. And after a while, it gets to you. We didn't ask anyone's permission to be who we are, to speak the language that we speak, to protect the values that are ours. It's a fundamental aspect of being a nation. So in the best of cases, if you don't harass us too much, that's what they tell us, we'll tolerate you. But I don't think Quebecers want to be...
Eric, what did you make of the Bloc's performance in this debate?
I think it's not unlike what we've seen from previous Bloc Québécois leaders like Gill, and that is that it's a free ride for them. It's not their audience, mainly Anglophones in other parts of the country. And so he can make his points, he can defend Quebec, and he can come out looking pretty relaxed about the whole thing. And I think he did. But I know when we were looking at the tracking that Ipsos and Darrell and his team were doing, it wasn't registering a lot because, of course, most of the audience was, English speaking, and so it's not somebody they're going to be able to vote for in anywhere else except in Quebec anyway. So I don't know that he ends up having a big impact. He eats up some time in chunks through the thing. He looks very relaxed. People can be impressed with his performance, but it doesn't move a lot of votes.
Darrell, was there an exchange between him and, say, Andrew Scheer that stood out for you?
Yeah, well, on the question of the energy corridor, but it was a really interesting reminder for a lot of Canadians, almost nostalgic reminder of what Quebec separatism used to sound like. I mean, this used to be the animating conversation and everything that had to do with Canadian politics, and we haven't heard it for a while. Well, folks, you heard it again. You heard it again tonight. And where they seem to really be coming down in terms of the important issues for Quebec separatists and sovereigntists these days is around the question of this energy corridor and what's going to happen with a pipeline going across the province of Quebec. He really stuck it to Mr. Scheer on that point tonight, obviously because he believes that there's a certain amount to pick up from people who are disenchanted with the Liberal Party on the from the Conservative Party, if they can, particularly around the city of Quebec, where the Conservatives were doing a little bit better. So he was dining out on him tonight, specifically on this issue.
Mercedes, granted this was an English debate, but how did the BQ do for you?
I think that the performance was remarkably strong, especially considering this is only relevant in one province in Canada. There's only one place you can vote for the Bloc Québécois. And for a lot of Quebecers, what they heard tonight would have been very appealing. He came down on the side of public opinion in Quebec. It may be completely out of sync with other parts of the rest of the Canada, but that's irrelevant for him. And he basically said that right off the top. He said, look, I'm not going to be the Prime Minister when they introduced and said, tell us what your government would do. I'm not going to be the Prime Minister, but here's what I'm going to do for Quebec. He knows his audience. He's extremely articulate. He's charismatic. And for the fact that he's debating in a second language, it's pretty remarkable. And he takes very controversial positions, whether it was saying that he believed that the arrest of the CFO, Meng Wanzhou of Huawei, was a mistake for Canadian farmers because they've paid the price on things like soya and canola, all the way up to Bill 21. He's not afraid to really get in there because he has very little to lose by taking those popular positions. But it was interesting because exactly what Darrell was saying, we haven't seen that presence of Quebec separatism and Quebec sovereignty in federal Canadian politics for years. The BQ had become a shadow of itself. It could barely maintain a leader. It didn't have any strong presence in the House of Commons. And now you see somebody who really has that political know-how and charisma in a place to make the Bloc relevant once again. And that could be a big problem for the Conservatives because that's really who they're competing against in Quebec.
All right, thanks for that, Mercedes. Indigenous issues was one of the big topics tonight. Here's an exchange between the two front runners.
We need to keep moving forward in a way that respects Indigenous peoples, respects that there's going to be a range of views, but is grounded in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that you have consistently blocked through your party's actions. That is not respect for Indigenous peoples. Perry Bellegarde, the Grand Chief of the head of the Assembly of First Nations, has said that no government has done more for Indigenous peoples than this government, and he's one of your constituents, Mr. Scheer.
That's right. He comes from Little Black Bear in my riding.
He'd love to talk to you.
He's got my phone number.
Give you a phone call sometimes.
I have nothing to learn from Mr. Trudeau, who fired the first Indigenous Attorney General for doing her job.
So, Mercedes, it was inevitable that Jody Wilson-Raybould would come up. What do you make of that?
Well, certainly inevitable would come up, and they tried to leverage it and use it in a powerful part of the debate. What didn't strike a chord for me about the Indigenous issues section of this debate was the lack of, frankly, Indigenous involvement. You had one Indigenous person who asked a question, and a lot of it devolved into discussions about climate change and pipelines. Not a lot of clear commitments from the various party leaders about what their government would actually do for Canada's Indigenous people. So I think it was a missed opportunity for all of the parties when it comes to that subject. It has really been something that has been largely ignored throughout the election. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has been the one who's come out and said that in the recent tribunal decision regarding Canada's Indigenous children who were forcibly removed from the reserves on the child welfare issue, that they should be compensated. Both Justin Trudeau and Andrew Scheer have said that they would challenge that decision in court, and that's the plan. So there really has been a bit of a lack of sync between those two federal party leaders and their promises on this particular issue.
Je serai là pour vous. L'argent du gouvernement
canadien. Let's go to
canadien.
Eric, get your thoughts on this.
Well, I think, only two parties have governed the country, the Conservatives and Liberals. We heard from Mr. Scheer and Mr. Trudeau there. Neither party has covered itself in glory on the Indigenous file over these many decades and centuries. So both of them are, fighting for to sound like they are reasonable with respect to Indigenous people. The Prime Minister has obviously made more headway in that regard as the leader of the government the last few years. I think Elizabeth May sounded very sincere in all that she had to say on that issue, but even as she did so, as Mercedes was saying, it was just another white person talking about it. There's a distinct lack of Indigenous participation when it comes to where we are right now in terms of the leadership in this country.
Darrell?
Well, the real question at the end of this is this going to change any votes? And I suspect not. In fact, the only way it probably adds any sort of political context to this is Mr. Scheer bringing it back to the SNC-Lavalin scandal and bringing that back onto the table, which we know does get has some impact on what people think about the Prime Minister's performance. But nobody covered themselves in glory tonight, I don't think.
Toward the end of the debate, Elizabeth May had some harsh words for Justin Trudeau. Here's what she said to him.
You can't negotiate with physics. You can't as Prime Minister, you can't as leader of the Liberal Party. There's a carbon budget. It doesn't budge. And that's why it's so heartbreaking for me to look at you today and know you could have done so much more the last 4 years. Please, God, you don't get a majority this time around because you don't keep your promises.
Mercedes, Elizabeth May is a very good debater. What did you make of that?
I thought that was an incredibly powerful moment for Elizabeth May, and you heard the audience really react to it, Robin, when she said, please, God, don't get a majority because you don't keep your promises. It's interesting, too, because Elizabeth May and Justin Trudeau have a close personal relationship. They're friends. And in the past, you've certainly heard May talk about the possibility of supporting a Liberal government in a minority situation. And here you hear her saying, not only, oh, well, perhaps I would support it, but saying, I don't want you to have a majority. I hope you don't get a majority because you don't keep your promises. That's very aggressive for May. That's a different tone than she's taken before. And watching that audience react, they liked that. She wasn't overly aggressive like some of the other leaders can be. She monitored her tone, but for her, that was sort of an extraordinary moment of her really hitting it. And you saw it on social media blowing up. You heard it in the room full of reporters. People reacted to that. It was a very powerful line for her on this. She is obviously the most dominant person in the room when it comes to climate change because that is the majority of the Green Party's focus. But that was certainly a moment there where I think she went after Justin Trudeau much harder than I've seen her do that before.
But she's also trying to get votes in the Maritimes.
Absolutely. Votes in the Maritimes, votes on Vancouver Island, where the Greens really think that they can eat not only into Liberal support, but into NDP support. So that's an area that they're really looking to pick up on. Climate change, is her jam. That's where she's going to get votes. It's not going to be foreign policy. It's not going to be the economy. It's going to be people who believe that there's a climate crisis. And so she has to make people believe that Justin Trudeau is not a reliable alternative if they are concerned about climate change. And at the same time, the Liberals are going to have to try to say, look, the Greens are never going to form government. So if you're concerned about climate change, don't let the Conservatives get into power because they're going to do nothing. Pick us. At least we've promised the carbon tax and brought it in. We're taking steps. Something is better than nothing. And I think that's where Jagmeet Singh had a really powerful line when he said, look, you don't have to choose between Mr. Delay and Mr. Deny. There are other options.
Darrell, let's bring you in on this. As Mercedes said, Elizabeth May said she could potentially form government with Justin Trudeau. So what was she doing here?
Well, I think that's exactly what she was saying to voters. She was saying, look, you've got other options than simply voting for the Liberal Party in order to protect the environment. You know that you think that we're the best, and we know this from our polling. When we ask Canadians who would do the best job on the environment, it's the Greens by a pretty long shot. So if you care about the environment, you can vote for us. We will hold Justin Trudeau to account because he will have a minority government after October 21st.
Eric?
Yes, and of course that's not how voting works. People will vote for one party or another, and you may get a minority. That is what she was saying when she said to Trudeau, "I hope you don't get a majority." What she means by that is because we want to be holding the balance of power in a minority. That's the same position that the NDP takes. But it is also the case that if they were to peel off enough votes from the Liberals in certain ridings, that could end up electing some Conservatives in those ridings. And you did not hear Ms. May and particularly Mr. Singh go after Mr. Scheer on his policies so much because they recognize that most of the votes that they're going to get, they're going to try and get them from the Liberals. But if they get more support, it could be that Mr. Scheer would benefit from that. And then what kind of government do they have? If it's a minority, I guess they will have, again, the balance of power. I mean, there's nothing that the Greens and the NDP would want more than a minority government, whichever party is, I guess, has the most seats.
Well, we've been talking about environment and energy as a key issue. What are your thoughts on that now after all of this debate? Eric?
I think it's been, I think it's a defining issue. I'm not sure it, in the end, has been more so defined than it was going into the debate. I think that you have, we've talked about this before, but that Trudeau is sort of in the middle of the group trying to portray himself to progressives as being as progressive as you need to be and have to be to those Green voters, to those NDP voters, at the same time saying to Liberals, we can still have an economy that will bring about a pipeline that will still not harm the environment too much. I mean, it's always a balancing act for the Liberal Party. It is that way on a lot of issues over the decades. The Conservatives, as we were saying earlier, they can count on, I think, getting the support of those people that say, I don't want a carbon tax, full stop, period, there's my vote. The split on the left side or on the progressive side is the one that is much trickier because a voter who's trying to calculate all that can only cast one ballot. He can't vote for a minority. He can only vote for one party or another.
Darrell, you want to pick up on that theme too?
Yeah, the way that the Conservatives go at this, because we have to bring them into the conversation too, is that for them, it's about what they call the job-wrecking, cost on everything carbon tax. So to the extent that they want to talk about greenhouse gases or they want to talk about climate change, they want to keep pivoting back to the issue of how much it's going to cost people to have a carbon tax. And I noticed that Mr.
Darrell, we're going to interrupt you right now because Elizabeth May is speaking at the podium. Let's take a listen.
Okay, thank you, Ms. May. Hannah Thibodeau, CBC National News. You and Mr. Singh seem to be fighting right now in the polls. They suggest you're fighting for third place. Do you feel he might have gotten the best of you tonight?
Not a bit. No, I felt quite comfortable and I didn't feel like we were fighting. I felt as though I made the points I needed to make, and I agree with Jagmeet Singh. It's not a choice between the Liberals and Conservatives. Canadians have options, and a real option is to vote Green.
What about the fact that he keeps bringing up this point about abortion and that you would allow people within your party to bring this up?
We are very clear that all of our candidates have been asked and answered the question that they would not bring it up because they are not pro-life. They are pro-choice. Now, the reality of it is, it's, I think, one of those great points about parliamentary democracy that in Canada we have allowed whipped votes to be routine. So I would say to Mr. Singh and to the NDP, why did they force every New Democrat, this wasn't Mr. Singh, of course, in 2011, every New Democrat was forced to vote for bombing Libya. I had women within the NDP come up to me afterwards, their faces with tears streaming down their face. But as recently as this spring, Mr. Singh had a whipped vote on a very minor issue. And you'll recall David Christopherson, a lot of viewers at home might not remember, but from the Parliamentary Committee on Parliamentary and House Affairs, when he voted on a minor issue against the way Mr. Singh wanted him to vote, Mr. Singh attempted to fire him from his position as vice chair of that committee. I think that's wrong. I think whipped votes are wrong. So Greens don't whip votes on any issue because we believe that members of Parliament should represent their constituents. That's why we screen to make sure they share our values before they get to Parliament.
Would you ever consider changing that?
It's a part of, there are 80 Green parties around the world. And all around the world, including the Greens in the European Parliament, they all work together. They strive to form consensus. But if there's not a consensus, MPs in the European Parliament for the Greens or in the Swedish Parliament for the Greens or wherever they are around the world, New Zealand, wherever, we don't believe in the idea that it's right to have someone elected to Parliament check their brains at the door and do whatever the leader tells them to do.
André Lajoie from Eagle News International. I was just wondering, can you talk about your platform and on pharmacare?
Oh, I'm very proud of the fact that in 2015, Greens were the only party calling for pharmacare. And because we do like working together, I'm very pleased that now the NDP have a position close to ours. The Liberals are not quite as clear, but we are really on the verge of being able to push through universal single-payer pharmacare. It's essential. And back to the affordability issue, the study that was issued earlier today, research done at St. Michael's Hospital made it clear that not only does pharmacare deliver better health results, it helps people make ends meet in a way that has a big impact on affordability. It brings down drug prices. It's really, the evidence from all around the world is clear. So we took the estimate the Parliamentary Budget Office gave us. We didn't provide as many limitations on our request. So it's we had a certain amount of sticker shock when we saw that PBO thought it would be $27 billion. But we found enough revenue to be sure that we can do it.
And how about more doctors in rural?
We need to renegotiate the Canada Health Accord. We need to go with what the medical community is recommending as having the patient's medical home be a team medicine approach. We need to rethink healthcare in the 21st century, but we really need a new Canada Health Accord. And we must never forget that while healthcare is delivered by the provinces, it's the Federal Minister of Health who's responsible for enforcing the Canada Health Act. And we've been too slack for too long in making sure we don't allow any creeping two-tier medicine into Canada.
Ms. May, hi. Murad Himari from The Logic. Yeah,
sorry.
So you've said on a couple of debate stages now that you would tax the tech giants, but your platform doesn't specify whether that's an e-commerce tax or sales tax, or whether you're looking for something like the 3% tax that Mr. Trudeau has proposed. So which one is it, and what form would that tax take?
That's also a plank you can find on the website reviewed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. So we're looking at the way they've done it in Europe. We're looking at making sure that we collect tax. It's not a sales tax. We need to make sure that we recoup, because Amazon, for instance, isn't benign. They compete with all the local small businesses that sell things across Canada. The same thing with Facebook and Google are undermining our journalists across Canada. So we're not looking at a sales tax. We're looking at a structure that brings the tax further upstream and ensures that Canadian e-commerce companies, whether it's Airbnb or Google or Facebook or Amazon or Netflix, are paying tax into the Government of Canada system, but not at the sales tax level.
Sorry, but what form exactly does that take? Is that a tax on revenue? Is that a tax on advertising revenue? Because the Parliamentary Budget Officer budgets it as a tax on e-commerce and specifically mentions sales tax loss, as well as taxes not collected on tangible products, which is also a version of a...
Well, there's several different ways in which it applies. The first thing is we need to close the loophole, which right now makes it more advantageous for businesses to put their ads with Facebook and Google instead of with publishers within Canada, because there is a loophole on tax. So at that level, it becomes a sales tax. At other levels, we'd be applying it further upstream to make sure that we collect, for instance, almost like a levy on their ability to do business within Canada. Bringing it and rolling it out, we also want to continue to look at the systems that are working. Now, Quebec has its own system. We want to make sure that we apply taxes on these e-commerce companies in a way that recoups for Canada a fair share of what they should be paying in taxes. I hope that's clear, because it's a very significant thing that we have so many companies doing business in Canada undermining and competing with Canadian companies, but not paying virtually no tax at all. And on the housing crisis, the fact that in British Columbia, 20% of our housing stock stands empty because they've been converted into Airbnbs. It's a complex area of business activity that we never anticipated even 10 years ago. Which is the next lineup? Sorry. No.
Merci.
Oh,
Merci. C'est beau. Merci beaucoup.
No, pas du tout. Well, gee whiz, guys. It's lovely to see you, and I guess you'll see the next person up. I had fun tonight. Thank you very much.
All right, let's take a sharp turn and talk about Maxime Bernier. Trudeau called him polarizing. Andrew Scheer launched a preemptive strike and said to Bernier, "You're all about likes and retweets from the dark world on Twitter." Mercedes, that was very interesting.
It was, and it's this moment where you saw Andrew Scheer go after Maxime Bernier for being far right, for the allegations that he has promoted and allowed people in his parties who have very controversial ideas, including some who promoted white supremacy at points, who have made racist comments, and some of the founders of the party, as we know from the reports we've been seeing in the media, and were involved in some of those comments. And tonight, Bernier himself used the term globalist, and that might sound to people like a relatively harmless term. They say globalist, okay, that means you believe in globalization, but the far right uses that term as a code word for Jewish people, and there's a lot of concern that is used to stir up anti-Semitic feelings. So you saw Andrew Scheer go right after Bernier on that tonight, and he's trying to really distinguish himself there because he's worried about being accused of being too far right or of not condemning elements inside his party that have said racist or xenophobic things. So this was him trying to stand out there and really go after Bernier and differentiate himself from that. I was not necessarily expecting him to be quite that strong when he said you're going to the darkest places on Twitter to seek this out. Of course, Bernier denies that. Bernier's party has not been successful in picking up the support that they were anticipating in this election. But that was a moment there where one of the things that we've seen talked about in this campaign is race, it's racism, it's the influence of the far right, it's concerns about xenophobia, it's concerns about the kind of discussions that are going on and the kind of sort of dog whistle politics that can underlie that. So that's a really critical moment that you saw there. Whether or not it earns Andrew Scheer any voters, I don't know, but he wanted to make that clear to fend off liberal attacks.
You think Bernier's reaction to what Andrew Scheer said to him?
Oh, that was to me. Sorry, we didn't hear that here. I think that what's interesting about Bernier, we were talking about this, Darrell and I, just while Mercedes was speaking, and it's true that when you look at the polls, Bernier is not registering very high. But Bernier makes the case, hey, there are a lot of quiet Canadians out there who believe what he believes. I mean, we were hearing things from Bernier I don't think I've ever heard from any federal leader on a national stage when he talks about we're just going to slash immigration by half. We're going to go from 300,000 to 150,000. That's, who knows what the impact would be on the economy. But it's such a clear message that he wants less immigration. And, back in the day when Preston Manning was onto the national stage, or Stockwell Day was onto the national stage, they had to withstand the attacks that they were too far to the right. And I think they did so often successfully. Bernier is saying, bring it on. Like, this is what I stand for. We want fewer immigrants. Interpret that any way you want. And Darrell, what were you noticing in terms of the impact it was having online?
Well, what it was showing in our tracking is through the night is that he was attracting a lot of attention. Now, a lot of it was negative attention, but people weren't ignoring him. Elizabeth May, on the other hand, just flatlined through the entire debate, almost at the bottom of the chart, really nobody paying that much attention to what she was doing. But Bernier, of the minor party candidates, was getting the most attention by a long shot.
That's right. There was volume, right, for each of them, as you might expect, and some of it's positive, some of it's negative. But Trudeau and Scheer are up at the top in the volume, and then of the other four, clearly ahead for much of that debate was Bernier.
He was getting a lot of attention, but for all the wrong reasons, as my mother used to say about me sometimes. Yeah.
Let's go in a whole different direction. Who makes the best prime minister after this debate, Darrell?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I don't think Canadians have a clear view on that, and we've been seeing it through the entire campaign. Mr. Trudeau, in our most recent polling, has moved a little bit ahead of Mr. Scheer, but there's no clear consensus candidate as the best prime minister. This is a very, very close race. It's a game of inches. The only big question for me through the course of the evening was, did Mr. Singh have enough of an impact on Mr. Trudeau to shake loose some of those progressive voters? And if he did, and we can see Singh move up from 15 in our polling up to, say, 17 or 18, that creates a much clearer path to, I would say, 24 Sussex, if it was still open, for Mr. Scheer.
Mercedes, we're going to bring in Mercedes. Mercedes, this was a very crucial debate when you consider the two front-runners are so close in the polls.
Well, and it's so unusual. I mean, we are late in the campaign. We're into the final 2 weeks. And not only is there not a clear front-runner, they're virtually deadlocked. And you see them going back and forth daily in clear areas where you'd expect perhaps to start to see more delineation by this point. That hasn't happened. And while Justin Trudeau is the incumbent, and it's extremely rare in Canadian politics to see an incumbent who's had a majority government lose government after one term. It's only happened twice in Canadian history. So in that sense, historically, the election should be his to lose. But Scheer has not managed to capitalize on a lot of the mistakes that Trudeau has made. He hasn't resonated. People don't seem to be comfortable with him in some cases. Why is that? And so the question is, does this debate tonight move things? For a lot of Canadians, it's the first time they'll really have tuned in. They may not have watched the full 2 hours, but they will watch those clips. And I think what's unfortunate is that we're not going to have another debate to see how people perform. In other elections, we've had more than one English debate. There's only one in this one, so that's it. That's all, folks. You won't get to see them take each other on again and to really see their personalities come out when they're confronted with each other and they actually have to defend themselves and attack. How do they look? Does that appeal to people? Does that look like somebody who you think could lead the country both at home and on the global stage? And this, unfortunately, is the only view we're going to have gotten of that before, at least in English, before they head to the ballot box.
Mercedes, that was the very first question, was how are they going to do on the international stage? How did you think they did with that question?
I don't think particularly well, and I think foreign policy and defense policy have been virtually absent from this debate, except for Andrew Scheer's promise to cut foreign aid by 25% to certain countries and reorient some of that. This is a day when you've seen Donald Trump say that he is going to pull the United States out of one of the most significant airspace agreements in the world that could have serious effects on the international alliance. You have questions about whether Turkey is about to invade northern Syria and how that could affect people, including our allies, the Kurds, who we fought alongside against ISIS. I mean, there are very serious international questions on the table, and they haven't been in this election campaign and they haven't been in this debate. That's not unusual, though, Robin, because it doesn't tend to be what people vote on, as important as it is.
Okay, Mercedes, we're going to hear from Justin Trudeau now.
Votre position à vous, c'est que la porte est ouverte à intervenir. Est-ce que c'est ouvert à intervenir juste en course
that you had left the door open to intervene. Does that mean just in the Supreme Court? Or does it mean regardless whether it be in the Supreme Court, the appeal court, or whatever it may be? I said I wasn't going to intervene in the present case because Quebecers are defending their rights as set out in the Constitution. They're defending their rights and freedoms. But I will not close the door to other steps because I believe that a federal government must always defend fundamental rights, whether it be francophones outside of Quebec, the rights of language minorities, or religious rights, or women's rights. So does that mean that you're going to intervene? No, it's not a decision that's been made. But I'm not going to close the door to a possible intervention because it would be irresponsible for a federal government to close the door on the possibility of intervening in such important cases.
Since your multiple use of blackface became an international scandal, Canada's international reputation has been irreparably harmed. Have you reached out to any African leaders or any leaders from the Middle East to apologize for your conduct?
Canada will continue to engage in a positive, constructive way around the world, standing up for human rights, engaging with leaders right around the world, because we know that promoting our values and prosperity for everyone around the world is good for Canadians and creates better opportunities for everyone.
So that didn't answer the question at all. Have you spoken to any African leaders or leaders from the Middle East to apologize for your personal conduct?
I have continued to engage with leaders around the world in a responsible way during an election campaign. My focus is connecting with Canadians, as I was able to tonight. And I was very pleased to see so many of the questions turn to the environment. In all sections, there was a clear contrast between those on stage who don't think we should be fighting climate change and those of us who do. And again, we are the only party with a clear plan to fight climate change.
Do you think this will hurt our bid for
Monsieur Trudeau, Michel Lamarche, TVA Nouvelle.
Mr. Trudeau,
votre stratégie ce soir
d'interpeller
Monsieur Singh pendant le débat sur la
call
loi
out Mr. Singh with regards to the debate about Bill 21 when you said that he didn't defend his convictions to the end. Is that in fact what you meant to say? Well, in particular in these moments where we see divisive politics, populism, it's important for leaders to show that they're going to be here to defend rights. And I believe this view that many Quebecers have that wouldn't want a federal government to interfere. But to me, the role of a federal government is always to defend freedoms and rights for everyone. It's not an issue of respecting jurisdiction or not. It's the responsibility of the federal government to be there to defend minorities, to defend women's rights, to defend marginalized communities, and it's something that I will always do. Mr. Blanchet was saying at the end of the debate that you don't say the same thing in English as you say in French. In English, you're much firmer with regards to Bill 21, and the same for pipelines. Would you be willing to impose a pipeline on Quebec? I've always said the same thing about Bill 21 in French and in English. I will not close the door to a possible intervention by the federal government because the role of the the fundamental freedoms of everyone. And that's exactly what I'm always going to keep in mind. In terms of pipelines, we set up a process whereby consultations with Indigenous communities, work with environmental groups is much clearer than before, and we're going to keep going with these processes in order to ensure that any project that is proposed be socially have a social license. So there's no pipeline proposed right now to cross Quebec. So we trust Bill 69 and our approach with regards to that.
This afternoon, a federal court judge ruled that I had a right to be here to cover this debate as a journalist, despite opposition from your Attorney General. This comes after 2 weeks of me being kicked out of or not allowed into your campaign rallies. The Conservatives have criticized you for being not as advertised. You've advertised yourself as a champion of press freedom. Will you take a stand right now, sir, as the leader of the Liberal Party and allow me to cover your campaign like every other journalist?
We are a party and we are a country that respects journalistic rights and respects the freedom of the press. We will continue to.
So is that a yes, sir?
We are a party and a country that respects the hard work and the freedom of the press, and we will continue to.
Then what time is your plane leaving tomorrow, sir? What time is your plane leaving?
Freelance, just yesterday, President Donald Trump greenlit the invasion of northern Syria. Would you stand with your Kurdish allies and do something about that beyond just words?
I was briefed on this situation by our national intelligence advisor and other top officials this afternoon. We are, of course, monitoring the situation very closely, along with our allies. Canada doesn't have any defense assets in Syria right now, but we are present in the Middle East, in Iraq, in a training mission where we are leading the NATO training mission, and we are continuing to ensure the safety of Canadians and stability in the region. This is a region where Canada has determined that it is in our national interest to be present, to promote peace and security, and to help train local forces to be able to combat Daesh. We will continue to monitor the situation closely.
Mr. Trudeau, I'd like to ask a question on pharmacare.
Oh, sorry.
Good evening, Mr. Trudeau. Teresa Wright from the Canadian Press. You chose to call out Mr. Singh on Bill 21 and also on an oil refinery issue, which he said wasn't true. Does this mean you're feeling threatened by the NDP at this point in the campaign, especially in areas where there are tight races?
On the contrary, we were pleased to contrast our approach and our approach on fighting climate change and our platform with all the leaders on stage. I think it's important for Canadians to be able to make a choice. And once again, I was very, very happy that so much of this debate throughout all the themes was actually on climate change and our approaches on fighting it. I just also need to highlight that Mr. Singh has been very clear on repeated occasions that part of the NDP's approach is to increase refinery capacity in Canada. He said it many times, and I think people need to understand that there are many different approaches on climate change, and of all the different approaches, there is only one plan that has been determined by a number of experts to be both ambitious and doable. And that is the plan that we've put in place over the past 4 years and are going to continue doing even more on.
I mentioned that you questioned Mr. Singh on Bill 21. You said in the debate that you're the only leader that would intervene, except that's not really what you've said. You've said you'll wait and see what happens with the legal challenge. Given that you've said that you feel this law is discriminatory, why aren't you taking a stronger stance on this, or stronger action?
The Charter is being defended the way it is designed to be. Canadians, Quebecers in this case, have taken their government to court over a law that they feel is unjust and discriminatory. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is established so that Canadians can defend their rights against a government that they feel has intruded on their fundamental rights. That is a way that our Constitution and our Charter of Rights works, and Quebecers are having this important conversation themselves. We are, of course, watching carefully. I have been very clear that I am in disagreement with that law, and I am the only federal leader who has said that it would be irresponsible to rule out intervening at a later moment to defend fundamental rights and freedoms, because a federal government needs to be there to defend fundamental rights, whether it's francophone rights in Doug Ford's Ontario, whether it's minority rights, whether it's women's rights or LGBT rights. A federal government needs to be ready to defend Canadians' rights right across the country. It's not about respecting jurisdictions, it's about fundamental rights.
Mr. Trudeau, on pharmacare, I think there's a lot of confusion around your position. You said you'd be guided in negotiations with the provinces, guided by the principles of the Eric Hoskins report. Does that mean a single-payer pharmacare system?
We, as a federal government, don't get to determine what the final look of national pharmacare looks like. We have committed to bringing in the recommendations and the model proposed by the Hoskins expert report, and we actually move forward on the significant elements that a federal government could move forward on. That is reducing drug prices by close to $13 billion across over the next 10 years, moving forward on creating a Canadian drug agency to establish a national formulary, and moving forward on the most expensive drugs for rare diseases that are extremely difficult for Canadians and indeed provinces to handle. But the next steps need to be negotiated with the provinces, and the provinces will have a say in what it looks like. The reason we are wary about certain provinces is, I don't intend to send money to Doug Ford so he can cut taxes for the wealthy even further. We need to make sure we're having responsible conversations with provinces that actually want to move forward on improving our Medicare system and moving forward on assurance médicaments, pharmacare, thank you, and we're going to keep doing that. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Bonne soirée.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
All right, that was Liberal leader Justin Trudeau taking questions after the debate. Let's bring in Darrell Bricker. Darrell, I just want to follow up on one of those reporter questions. Should Trudeau be threatened by Jagmeet Singh?
Yeah, he should, because the largest group of swing voters in this election campaign are NDP Liberal swing voters. And for both the Greens and the Liberal Party, the NDP are the preferred second choice. So if Jagmeet Singh is able to light some fire under his campaign, the party that is going to probably suffer the most will be the Liberal Party. And Justin Trudeau is statistically tied at the moment with Andrew Scheer and the Conservative Party. So if a couple of percent of votes happens to go to the NDP, that's a big problem for Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals.
Eric, one of the reporters, she spoke in French, and she said that the strongest answer that Trudeau gave about Quebec secular law was in French, opposing it. What do you make of that?
Well, his response to it was that he's been making the same declaration in both English and French, which is that he's not ruling out the government coming forward with an intervention at some later date. I think we talked about this earlier. I think it's entirely predictable that the Liberal Party, if they are in government, will probably, once the election is behind them and they're not worried about how it would affect winning seats in Quebec, would very likely move forward. He's made that completely clear in terms of his own personal views on the secularism bill. So I don't know that there was a lot of separation between his answer in French and his answers in English, but from what I interpreted, he's wanting to leave himself that little bit of wiggle room that just is just a little bit further along on this path than the other parties that are also saying they're against it, but they're not going to try to intervene.
All right, let's go to Mercedes. Mercedes, one of the reporters asked why he hadn't spoken to any African nations about the brown-face, black-face issue that doesn't seem to go away. He didn't answer the question, though, did he?
No, he didn't. And I believe that was actually a reporter from the Rebel, which was initially banned from the debates. They were not accredited. They challenged it in federal court, where actually the Rebel didn't, but an organization called True North, run by Candace Malcolm, challenged it in court. And the federal court ordered that they had to allow those media outlets in. And they are highly controversial.
All right. Well, Andrew Scheer has actually stepped up to the podium. Mercedes, we're going to interrupt you and let him take questions from reporters.
In English. I'm very happy with the results of today's debate. I was able to articulate my positive vision for Canadians about a government that will live within its means to leave more money in your pockets so that you can get ahead. So I'm happy to take your questions.
I'm Mr. Scheer, Tom Parry with CBC News. You're talking about a positive vision. You opened up the debate by calling Mr. Trudeau a phony and a fraud. That seems quite negative. So I'm wondering, do you think that's what Canadians are looking for in this election?
Well, I was looking forward to the moment that I would finally be able to hold, to demonstrate Justin Trudeau's hypocrisy on so many different issues. And like millions of Canadians, I have become very frustrated with the things that he has said that are just patently false, the lies that he has told, the fact that he is continuing to refuse to allow the RCMP to do their job. And I think it was very important to make that point early on in the debate tonight. And of course, I also used several opportunities to articulate my positive vision for Canadians.
Mr. Trudeau said that Mr. Bernier is saying out loud what you say in private. You were also questioned tonight about your stance on abortion repeatedly. So do you think that your campaign was in any way damaged tonight?
Not at all. And again, we see these types of desperate attacks from Justin Trudeau. This is what Liberals do when they get in trouble. They start to try to create fear and division on these types of issues, and I think Canadians can see right through it.
L'inaudible, la presse canadienne, bonsoir. Pour
Good
revenir sur
evening.
le ton, les
To
mots
come
fourni
back
et
to
fraud,
the tone that you used, phony and fraud, did you find equivalence in French for Thursday, and why are you going that far?
C'est le même message en français.
But it's the same message in French as in English. Mr. Trudeau has lied to Canadians. He's told lies. He's always hiding the truth. And even tonight, he didn't allow people in PMO's office and Prime Minister's office to testify with the RCMP. So I think it's very clear to Canadians that Trudeau is not who he's pretending to be. But you used insults, Mr. Scheer. You used fraud and phony. Do you have equivalent words in French? And why don't you just criticize, just as you just did now? And why did you decide to use these words? I used these words because they apply. Mr. Trudeau always hides the truth. He pretends to be for First Nations. He fired the Attorney General, who is First Nations, because she did her job. So I'm going to continue to show Canadians that Justin Trudeau says things that aren't true and is not who he pretends to be. With regards to Bill 21, there's a bit of confusion, it seems. Could you please clarify your position? If a Conservative government is elected, would it not intervene at any step of the legal procedure, not even in Supreme Court? I've always been clear, we are not going to intervene. Never. Yes. And when Alain Reyes says that the Conservatives are the best positioned to protect secularism, are you going to act positively for Bill 21? Are you going to protect secularism, or are you going to simply do nothing? Is that what it means for you to protect secularism? Well, we have the same message with my team. We've always been clear. We are not going to intervene.
Todd Lamoran, APTN National News. In tonight's debate, you kind of suggested that duty consult was important. But if you form government and you've done all your duty to consult with First Nations, and some of them still say no, will you build TMX anyway?
It's important to recognize that for thousands and thousands of Indigenous Canadians, the source of prosperity and jobs and opportunity comes from big energy projects. The number one industry that employs Indigenous Canadians is the mining sector. The company that employs the largest amount of Indigenous Canadians is an oil and gas company. And it's very important that we create a system where concerns can be addressed. And if a First Nations community has a concern, if they are impacted by a proposed project, that their concerns have to be taken into account and addressed. And at the end of the day, we get to a system where big projects can proceed. And so my message to Indigenous Canadians is that we will take our duty to consult very seriously. We'll have dynamic consultations. We will ensure that a cabinet minister has the responsibility to personally oversee these types of consultations. That is the basis of our national energy corridor that I am proposing, so that we can take care of these types of consultations, so that we can balance the needs to preserve and recognize and protect treaty rights, but also to get to a place where big projects can proceed again.
Of course, you have more First Nations in your riding than anyone else. What do you tell leaders from those communities about why your party is alone in not wanting to adopt the UNDRIP?
Well, as you know, Perry Bellegarde comes from my riding. He was former chief from one of the First Nations reserves in my riding. And I've asked him, and I've asked other Indigenous Canadians who are promoting and supporting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, what free, prior, and informed consent means. Because First Nations communities recognize that respecting Indigenous rights means respecting their rights to say yes. And when you have 30+ Indigenous communities who had signed partnership agreements with Northern Gateway, when you have dozens of First Nations communities that will benefit from Trans Mountain, we need to ensure that they have those possibilities for economic prosperity. It will not happen if any one First Nation or can veto projects. That is something that First Nations communities leaders and grassroots members of Indigenous organizations are concerned about as well.
Mr. Scheer, Murad Hamadi for The Logic. Starting January 1st, 2020, stock options for employees of companies will be capped at $200,000 for the year. The NDP and the Greens have both proposed higher sort of levies on the stock options deduction. Would a Conservative government reverse the policy that's set to go into place on the 1st of January?
Well, we certainly don't believe in higher taxes. We would disagree with other parties who say that taxes have to be raised. Justin Trudeau originally proposed on taxing all stock options, failing to recognize the fact that this is exactly how companies start up in Canada, that many high-tech companies start off very small with small groups of people, small numbers of people who have foregone paychecks while they're investing in a company. If you want to kill innovation in Canada, if you want to make sure that Canada cannot compete for the world's best and brightest and the types of investments that grow companies, raising taxes on innovators is a great way to do it. That's why Conservatives are opposed to higher taxes.
Sorry, but that didn't answer my question. My question was, will you revoke the cap?
Well, as I said, we are certainly going to ensure that taxes don't go up on Canadians. I note that Justin Trudeau launched an attack on small businesses, calling them tax cheats, so we've committed to rolling those back. We will always fight, we'll always make sure under a Conservative government that Canadians have a low tax environment so that they can do what they do best, which is innovate, grow companies, and succeed.
Molly Thomas, CTV National. You've said, like the Liberals, that you would appeal the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision that awarded major compensation to families, Indigenous families that were hurt in the foster care system. Why would you challenge that? We've never heard why.
Well, as I've indicated, I think it's very important that the federal government takes its responsibilities to Indigenous Canadians very seriously, and ensuring that compensation for wrongdoing in the child welfare system is acknowledged. When you're dealing with a ruling of this magnitude, when you're looking at the impacts this will have on government departments and on policies surrounding this issue, and the compensation amount, we believe it's the appropriate thing to do to ensure that there's judicial review over this decision.
Let me ask about the tone and the format of the debate. You said you have been waiting to challenge Justin Trudeau. Did you think you had enough time and Canadians heard enough from the two frontrunners today, considering there were 6 people at the microphones?
Well, I would have liked to have had more time to go directly back and forth with Justin Trudeau. I would have liked to have had more opportunities both to challenge him and to explain to him how our policies will actually make life easier for Canadians, how our policies will actually make life more affordable, and show to him and to Canadians how his policies will make the cost of living go up even higher. I would have liked to have more opportunities to do that, but the format was the format this evening. Thanks very much.
Mr. Scheer, Anya Kadadeglia from the Wire Report. So the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens have all introduced plans to lower wireless bills. Are you planning to tackle the issue of telecom affordability in any way?
Well, I would challenge you on that premise. What Justin Trudeau has proposed is a plan with a goal without a plan. He says this is something he's going to do just by asking companies to do it. If that would have worked, why hadn't he done that years ago? And a goal without a plan is just a dream. I don't expect anything to come from Justin Trudeau's platform.
So do you have a goal or a plan when it comes to telecom?
We believe in ensuring that robust competition in Canada is we believe that robust competition is the best way to make sure that Canadians have affordable services. But like I said, on this, like so many other aspects of his platform, it is just not as advertised. He claims to have a platform. Over half his policies, over half his announcements have not been costed. There's no numbers to back it up. And on this particular issue, he's not even explained to Canadians how he do it, other than just asking the telecom companies to do it. I don't take anything he says with any confidence. Thanks very much, everyone. Merci beaucoup.
All right, there you go. Andrew Scheer speaking as the Conservative leader after the debate. Let's bring in Mercedes. Mercedes, I keep cutting you off. My apologies. But I want to get your thoughts on the fact that he still tries to stick it to Trudeau even in those news conferences.
Well, I think it tells you that they're the two biggest challengers for each other. It still really is down between the Liberals and the Conservatives, and they're neck and neck. So he is going to attack Justin Trudeau at any chance. And it's not even that the Conservatives really need people to come out and vote for them. They have a strong base. What they need is to discourage Liberal voters so that they stay home. That alone can be enough to put a Conservative government into power. So they're going to attack Justin Trudeau. He's not as advertised as they like to say. He's breaking promises. He's broken the following promises. He hasn't costed his platform. It's going to cost you money. You can't trust him. All those kinds of messages to hope that people who might have turned up to vote for Justin Trudeau in the last election won't be doing that in this election. And you'll continue to see that attack. Justin Trudeau is going to defend his record and try to ignore Andrew Scheer as much as possible. And you see that in the way that he phrases things. He talks about Stephen Harper. He talks about Jason Kenney. He talks about Doug Ford. He very rarely talks about Andrew Scheer. Whereas with Andrew Scheer, it's the opposite. He talks about Justin Trudeau all the time. And so you saw that tonight, not necessarily a lot of information about what exactly the Conservative government would do or offer, and you heard Justin Trudeau attacking them on that. They've not put out their platform yet, and we're less than 2 weeks from the election day.
Darrell, let's bring you in. He seemed to be laser focused on attacking Trudeau, as Mercedes mentioned. He didn't have a problem calling Trudeau a phony and a fraud, and even smiled during that news conference. What do you make of that?
Well, that's a bit of a change of tone for Andrew Scheer. But you know, for the Conservatives, their number one goal here is to remind the public, the voting public, why they should be disappointed with the Liberal Party. So as Mercedes was correctly stating, part of it is they think they can attract some of those Liberal voters, but along with that, they can also send some of those voters to the group I like to call the apathy party, which is the party that people won't vote for. It's staying home and forgetting that there's an election on.
Well, we're about to actually hear from Andrew Scheer's rival, Maxime Bernier, so let's listen in.
Bernier, l'inaudible, la presse canadienne. Oui. Ça devait être une confrontation entre vous et M. Scheer.
It was supposed to be a confrontation between you and Mr. Scheer. Did you get what you wanted? Were you happy with your exchanges? Yes, I'm happy. We had the opportunity to talk about real things, our platform. I was able to show Canadians that the People's Party is different from the other parties that were there. We have policies to ensure that we have a government in Ottawa that respects the Constitution, but I also show Mr. Scheer and Mr. Trudeau will not balance the budget, and it looks bad for the future of our country. What did you learn tonight in terms of forms or substance of the debate that will help you in the future? Well, I liked it. At the beginning it was a bit stressful. I think that's normal. But for me, it was a good experience. I was awaiting this moment, and I'm happy that we were able to participate. And as an experience, well, I liked the experience where I'm allowed to speak about public policy, and I'm one of the only ones that really discussed our platform without attacking the other leaders too much, and that was important.
Hi, Cian Bexty, Rebel News, right here. My question revolves around journalism in Canada. 3 journalists came to this debate tonight, but they weren't going to be let in, myself included. We had to apply for an emergency court injunction to be allowed to cover the one English debate that our Prime Minister took part in. What does that say about the state of journalism in Canada and the contempt that the Prime Minister currently has for journalists?
It's a shame, you know. We're a free democracy. We believe in freedom, and it's too bad that what happened right now. It's the same thing for me on the stage. You know, Mr. Singh said that I didn't have my place over there because of what I'm saying about immigration. But actually, you know, I'm a voice for the big majority of Canadians that want fewer immigrants. And the fact that some people doesn't want us to debate, and some people don't want you also to be here. It's not a Canadian way, and I hope that you'll be able to be treated like a journalist.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And my follow-up revolves around what you were saying. 6% of Canadians want higher immigration. That's what the data says.
Yeah.
Do you think that the other leaders just think that Canadians need to take some tough medicine, or do they just not believe the data?
Well, first of all, I think that they don't want to agree with Canadians. I think they don't want to do that debate. You saw that on stage. You know, they were all against me on that. But actually, that's a position that it is in line with Canadians. But the most important also, if you want to preserve that country, if you want that country to be like that in 25 years, that's the time to have that discussion. And I'm very proud that I was able to have that discussion.
Monsieur Bernier, Philippe Vincent Foisy de Radio-Canada.
Oui.
Monsieur Trudeau dit que, au fond, ce que vous êtes ce soir, c'est ce que Andrew Scheer pense tout bas. Donc,
are saying tonight is what Andrew Scheer thinks to himself. Do you agree with him that you are the more conservative voice of Andrew Scheer, the more extreme voice of Andrew Scheer? Well, I asked Andrew Scheer a question. I told him that Mr. Scheer is more liberal than a conservative. So Mr. Scheer and Mr. Trudeau are the same. It's the same policies with regards to immigration, same policies with regards to not balancing the budget, same policies with regards to foreign aid and other policies. And I like to say that people who really believe in the free market and a smaller government in Ottawa, it's the People's Party who represents them. Tonight, if you had the choice, would you have preferred to be the leader of the Conservative Party rather than the People's Party? No. No, I'm very happy. We have a party in less than a year. A lot of people here doubted our capacity to be present and to be a national party, and I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to thank all those who allowed us to be here tonight. For me, it was my happiest moment in politics, because we do politics differently. There's no taboo for us. We say things as they are. We don't try to please everyone. That's the difference between the People's Party and the other political parties.
Eagle News International. I was just wondering, what do you think about the climate changes? As you know, that we have been having lots of floods in Quebec, Ontario.
You're speaking about the weather.
Yeah.
You're not speaking about the climate.
Well,
so you have a question on the climate?
Yeah.
Yeah, the climate is always changing, and I don't have any problem with that. The normality for the climate is changing. So what I'm saying, I don't believe that the main reason for that is the human activity on this planet. It is not the main reason why the climate is changing. There's a lot of other factors. So what you're saying about what happened right now, it's the weather, and that's why I'm the only leader who does not believe in these climate change hysteria or climate change emergency. All these people want Canadians to change their way of life, and they don't want us to have a debate about climate change. We need to have a debate, and it is too important for the future of this country. So I want to impose Canadians on climate change. I want to impose costly regulation on Canadians. And as you know, the environment is a shared jurisdiction, so provinces can have policy on climate change. But like I said in the debate, we must have concrete actions for the environment, and that it is what I propose: concrete action for the environment. Be sure that we have clear legs, clear levers, and put more money there than on fighting on climate change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there you have it, Maxime Bernier from the People's Party of Canada. We want to get your final thoughts, Darrell Bricker, Eric Sorensen, on the entire debate. Darrell, what stood out for you the most in this debate?
I mean, we often go through these debates. I've watched a lot of them over time, and people seem to do better or worse, depending on expectations during the course of a debate. The final question, though, was really, does it matter? I mean, are we going to see any votes move? And until we start seeing the polling come out later this week, we really won't know.
Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I think I look at the polls and where the voting public is right now, and at one end of it, we just saw Mr. Bernier, and I think one of the things I'm curious to see is whether those 2 percentage points that he's getting right now will get a boost, because when you're the leader of a smaller party, having a chance to be on a national platform like the National Leaders Debate is an opportunity to reach people, and even if it's with a message that we think is not that popular, but maybe more popular in his view amongst people that just aren't maybe out there saying so. At the other end of it is where Mr. Scheer and Mr. Trudeau are. Neither is pushing above 35%, really. They're both hovering around there. I'm not sure either of them saw that their images burnished tonight. There was a lot of incoming, a lot of bruising happening to Mr. Trudeau. That could diminish him. It's unclear to me whether Mr. Scheer will gain out of his attacks on Mr. Trudeau, or whether the strategy is mostly just to bring Mr. Trudeau further down, and as Darrell says, to send some of those other voters for the Liberals to hope that maybe they would stay home. So we do really have the potential, I think, for the winner to have an almost historically low percentage of the popular vote if it is somewhere in the mid-30s.
All right, thank you both for your insight. We're going to give the final word to our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stephenson, who's been out there in the cold tonight out in Gatineau. Your final thoughts.
Well, Robin, I think it was a chance for Canadians to see the leaders engage with each other, and that can be very revealing about policies as well as personality. It's rare in Canadian politics to see a clear, really strong winner or a knockout punch or a moment that totally changes the campaign. But the debates can be the start of momentum for somebody to start to move into first place. So to what Darrell and Eric were saying, it will be really interesting to see if this actually starts to move the polls, and we won't know for a couple of days. But I think it was the first chance for a lot of Canadians to really feel that they were getting to know the leaders and to see who appealed to them and who didn't. And at this point, the scrutiny starts to get a lot more intense on these leaders on the campaign trail. They're all heading out back tomorrow. They're back in Ottawa for the debate again on Thursday. That's the French language debate. That will be the second French language debate. But now is when they're really into the critical time where even 1 or 2 percentage points in that popular vote could make the difference not only between a win and a loss, but a minority or a majority government.
All right, Mercedes Stephenson, thank you for that. And that concludes our special post-debate coverage. There's much more analysis on our website at globalnews.ca. I'm Robin Gill. Thank you for watching. Have a great night.
This has been a